Well, here we are with more dead people. As a matter of fact, tonight, they're deader than they were last week because they've been at it longer. I believe that it's safe to say that all of us think of this country of ours as a nation which immigrants have built, and so it is. Englishmen, Frenchmen, Spaniards laid the foundations. Then came Germans and Irish, Scandinavians, Central Europeans, North Europeans, Eastern Europeans, people from around the Mediterranean, Italians, people from the East, Orientals, Africans. And yet, as we run through this long list of immigrants, I doubt if too many of us often stop to think as to who is first in line. Now, that's what we want to talk. The first Americans were not the Englishmen who settled at Jamestown in 1607. They were not even the Spaniards. They were the American Indians. Now, no matter where Columbus and the men who followed him touched in the New World, whether it was way up in the Arctic North or down in the Antarctic South or in between, they ran into men. Columbus, remember, felt that he had found the East, and he called these people Indians. Now, we know that he was mistaken, but strangely enough, the name is stuck. These are very interesting people. Columbus was a latecomer to the New World. It's a matter of cold historical fact that a good 5 centuries before Columbus arrived, the Vikings working out from Scandinavia, and in particular Leif Erikson, had discovered this New World, or had touched on the North American continent. Centuries and centuries before that, other men, the Indians, had been here, making themselves the first in a long, long line of immigrants, which still continues today. Now, it's a rather fascinating question as to who these first Americans were, and when they came, if they came. Maybe they're natives, maybe they're immigrants, why they came, how they came, and so on. A few of those questions we are going to try to answer. Now, the historian is a bit at a loss at this particular point, because always remember this, that history is made from the records, or is told from the records that men leave behind them. Until there are such records, the historian is offside. The period before that is what is known as prehistoric or prehistory. In this field, he has to have recourse to certain of his fellow scholars. He asks the geologist, for example, and the geologist will furnish him a certain amount of information about the age of the earth. The paleontologist, the paleobotanist, will give him information about the early animals, about the flora. The anthropologist makes it his point to study primitive man and to learn as much as he can about this rather fascinating creature. He's a little bit, the anthropologist is cramped in his, in the material available to him, but nevertheless he comes up with some very, very interesting conclusions, and we will, to a very large extent, base our information upon what he has to tell us. There's the archaeologist who digs up the information or the sites of ancient primitive civilizations and tries to reconstruct that life. All of these people give information, and pooling that information, the historian is in a position to say something about prehistory. Now, I'll make one word of caution. What we say here, I think, is sound. It may not always be solid. In other words, in the state of research, such as it finds itself today, these are the majority, the most plausible conclusions. Now, tomorrow, there may be a new find which will upset everything which is said today. We have to leave that way open, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to kind of pepper this discussion tonight with such expressions as probably, possibly, it seems, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to dodge the issue. I'm just trying to give you the story as it is. We are not absolutely sure. Now, let's go to these questions one after another, and let's start out with who. Who were these people? Oh, there have been a tremendous number of answers given. The early Spaniards were very interested in it, and they came up with a certain number of observations. For example, they brought up as the answer to who one of the stock early answers to such a question. The Indians, they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Nobody accepts that today. Later, some rather fantastic stories, some rather interesting stories for that matter, were developed. There was this supposed continent of Atlantis. And in the course of time, it was overtaken by some sort of a catastrophe. And just before it sank down, just as it was more or less going down, gurgle, 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 you know, and the enterprising Atlantidans jumped in their little boats and made for the West and become the first Americans. The people who loved the Pacific were not to be outdone by the Atlantic group, and they developed the story of the fabulous land of Mu. And it, at a certain time, was the victim of a catastrophe, and the Muians, or the Lemurians, did very much the same thing, and they say they were the first Americans. Now, today, in general, nobody takes those early explanations, and even somewhat late explanations, seriously. Most scholars today are in agreement that the first Americans were Asiatics. Oh, there are differences as you read them. Some of them say that they were Mongoloids. Sort of early, what shall I say, early relatives of the Chinese, the Mongolians of today. Other people say, no, the American Indian is much too diversified a person to be a single racial stock. And they claim to find Negroid elements, even Australoid elements. At any rate, whether we make him a Mongoloid or whether we say that there are other influences that have been brought to bear, it doesn't really, for our part of the story, make a great deal of difference. In all events, he is an Asiatic. Now, whether the mixture with these other elements took place after he got to the Americas, whether a Negroid strain came over to the Americas and then mixed with a Mongoloid strain, that we'll skip. Who is he? He's an Asiatic. Probably, dominantly Mongoloid. Now, in saying who he is, we have answered the other one other question: whence did he come? He came from Asia. Now we get to the most interesting and the most tantalizing and the most unsatisfactory or unsatisfying question of the bunch: when did he come? Well, here we are. When the white man gets to the Americas, he finds among some very magnificent cultural acquisitions, he finds a certain number of very definite cultural deficiencies. For example, there are none of the common domesticated animals which the old world has known for centuries. There's no horse, there's no cattle, there's no sheep, and so on. About the only thing that they have in common by way of a domesticated animal is the dog. But these others, no. There is a lack in the New World of common domesticated grains and plants, bread grains like wheat, and so on, barley, millet, rye. The Indians no matter how far they are advanced, and some of them, as we'll see, have made rather important advances, the Indians are without such useful inventions known for a long time in the Old World as the wheel, as the plow. Now, we know, and the archaeologist helps us out and tells us that a number of these things, not necessarily the wheel or the plow, but the domestication of animals and grains, took place in what is known as the Neolithic age. And then, see, this is in contradistinction to the Paleolithic age. You have here the New Stone Age, the Older Stone Age, and the idea is based, for example, upon an analysis of the instruments that were found. For instance, the instruments in the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, were much more rough, whereas you get something of polished stone in the New Stone Age, in the Neolithic. Now, we can date this pretty well. The Neolithic, somewhere around 8,000, 9,000 BC. We're going to throw zeros around in this lecture, pretty much as the budget makers and so on in Washington do, somewhere around that time. Now, the conclusion is that if we find man in the Americas without these things which were developed in the Neolithic, the presumption is, therefore, that he came before these inventions had an opportunity either to be developed or to spread around. So we can get something of a point at which, or by which, man must be in the New World. And we'll throw that roughly back to 8, 9, 10,000 years ago. Now, for quite a time, the anthropologists and the prehistorians were perfectly satisfied with that explanation. The geologists and so on told them that about the Great Ice Age, during which time practically the whole upper half of the globe was covered with ice. Now, we know, for example, that this ice came down very far. And the paleontologist also tells us that many of these prehistoric animals, these tremendous prehistoric animals, gargantuan in size and the like the mammoth and the mastodon, the dinosaur, the saber-toothed tiger, the dire wolf, the giant bison, the early horse, and so on, that these animals did not survive the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, very long. Now, there's a great deal of discussion as to whether they died during this Pleistocene due to the rigors of the climate, or whether they were destroyed shortly after the ice began to recede. There are 2 or 3 explanations given that there was a volcanic upheaval. There's another explanation that there was some type of a pestilence and that they were destroyed by the tsetse fly. There's another explanation that is offered that man, using fire, helped to destroy them. In other words, burned the prairies and the like, or ran them over cliffs, and the result was that they disappear. Now, the other conclusion that the geologists give us is this, that during this Ice Age, and in North America, the last of the glaciations comes down pretty far. Maybe it'll be a little clearer on this other map over here. The last of the glaciations more or less sweeps through the Middle West, Ohio, southern Missouri, Kansas, and the like. They say that man could hardly have subsisted. And that fits in perfectly with what the anthropologists had told us. that he must have been in the Americas, oh, maybe about 10,000 years ago. They figure that it took about that long for the area to become livable by humans. So they were pretty well set. And then back in the 20s and in the 30s, there began to be a number of finds made, first around Folsom, New Mexico, then around Clovis, over in the Sandia Range around Albuquerque, and then little by little up through Colorado and all through this more or less western plains and intermountain area up as far as Alaska. Now, these Folsom men worked their arrow points, their spearheads and so on, in rather characteristic fashion. For example, I haven't got a Folsom point here, but your ordinary arrowhead, for instance, if you were to take a cross view of it, would be broken something like that. Now, the Folsom hunters pulled it down, put a groove in it, much like that. I'll admit I'm pretty lousy as an artist. That's one reason I keep away from the board. It's about as bad as my handwriting, so I print. But at any rate, here they find these. They find these points. No one of these Folsom men or these Sandia men was thoughtful enough to lie down and die so we could find his skeleton. They haven't found a skeleton yet. But they find these points in connection with certain of these giant animals, like the mammoth, the giant bison, and the like, which throws them back, throws evidence that man was there back, 15,000, maybe as far as 25,000 years ago. We're still up in the air. Maybe we'll find something that will tell us more about it. But at the present state of development, we can say, I think with a fair amount of assurance, that man was in the Americas possibly as far back as 8,000 BC, maybe pull it down a little bit, 7,000 BC. Now, how did he come? There have been a number of explanations given, but today the common explanation is going to be via the Bering Strait entry. In other words, he comes from Asia, he moves over here, and then gradually works his way down through the North American continent on into South America and spreads out to the point where the Europeans find him wherever they touch. Now, this water gap that we know today is only 56 miles. He may not have had great boats, but there are possibilities that far, far back there may have been a land bridge. Maybe far back the strait froze over and he could come over on the ice. We do know this, that in the period of the late glaciation, the so-called Wisconsin glaciation, most of Alaska up here was free of ice. And therefore, it's perfectly possible that some of these animals whom the people who were to be the first Americans hunted came over here, and this became sort of a giant game preserve. And the hunters followed them along and came that way, then little by little spread out over the whole of the continent. How did he come? He came by the Bering Strait, port of entry, let's call it that. Why did he come? Well, there we need records, and we haven't got them. But remember that man changes very little. Oh, externally he changes, but underneath he's the same no matter what the color of his skin, no matter what his geographic location. So why do people move? Better, greater security, better position, seeking adventure, maybe getting away from a troublesome mother-in-law. Who knows? Take most any one of those, and you probably won't be far wrong. Now, there's another point, too. What did he bring with him? When the Europeans arrive, they find, for example, that the Indians in this so-called mid-American area have achieved a great degree of culture. Mexico, Colombia, and down here to Peru, the land of the Incas. These are the people, for example, who built their lives around agriculture and developed the great American plant, namely maize or Indian corn. Now, working out from this area, knowledge of agriculture spread to various other areas, and in North America, for example, we have this region of the Pueblos up here. We have a region, the southern woodland over here. Both of these are quite highly advanced tribes. Then there's a region up here, the so-called northern woodland. The Iroquois are among the very important people, the Hurons and the Algonquins and the like. This region down through the middle, the Plains Indians, with whom we are very familiar due to the westerns and the movies and the like. A California Great Basin area over here, and a Fisher area here, and then this whole region up here, which doesn't come in to the American story to any great degree, the Eskimo. Now, this central area, this nuclear area, whose life is to a very large extent built around agriculture and built around particularly corn, cultivated with very crude instruments. This is the region which has a great many contributions to make. Now, we're inclined to think, I believe, that the Europeans brought everything to the New World. Actually, there's an amazing list of plants and even of inventions, we'll call them inventions, they may not be mechanical inventions, inventions which the Indians had waiting for the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the other Europeans. If we were to run through this list, you would really be amazed. We've got a few of the things here which the Americas gave to the rest of the world. One of the most important is corn, Indian corn. We're inclined to think, for example, that our old friend here, the Murphy, that's supposed to be the Irish potato. Well, now, did you ever know that the Irishmen got it from the Americans? And even though the Irishmen have more or less put their trademark on it, it's still an American product. The sweet potato. This is a rather handsome sweet potato, but developed by the American Indians. Then such things as a whole family of gourds, the pumpkin, the squash, the calabash, and so on. Beans, particularly the red bean, the frijol. Then lima beans and so on and so forth. All of these were waiting for the European as they began to get around. Such things, for example, as the tomato is an American contribution. Now, before somebody contributes this to us, we'll put it in a safe place. Pineapple, strawberries, various types of nuts. In other words, did you ever stop to think that it might have been pretty dull at one of the medieval tournaments? Oh, it might have been rather quiet, too. Nobody would have been going through the stands hollering peanuts, popcorn, chewing gum, cigars, cigarettes, chocolate bars. None of those until they had discovered America. Great contribution that America has made to the entertainment world. It's sort of a side contribution and the like. Now, then such things as rubber, the hollow rubber ball, drugs, the whole coca family, quinine, ipecac, and down the line. Then a very useful thing, probably they had the Navy in mind when they did it, the Indians of the American forest developed the hammock. In other words, you couldn't lie on the ground down there in the Amazon forest with the creepers and the crawlers, so they got themselves up. These were extremely ingenious people. They had made rather important advances and had much to give the Europeans when they came. Now, all we've been able to do is just scratch the surface. Let me show you one or two books that, of many that you might care to read. If you'd like to read about these men that upset all our calculations, the Sandia, the Folsom Men, the Lost Americans by Frank C. Hibben, one of the important field men who has dug up a good deal of that information. Then a standard work on the American Indian by one of the important American Indian anthropologists, The American Indian by Clark Whistler. A rather recent and interesting study along the same lines, not quite as technical, Ruth Underhill's The Red Man's America. Then, if you're interested in archaeology to a very large extent, along with anthropology, three men of the Chicago Museum of History, Martin, Quimby, and Collier, have developed this book, Indians Before Columbus. Really a most fascinating study. Now, if you'd like to know something about some of these Indians who have well, made their name and developed a civilization, you have Means's Ancient Civilization in the Andes about the Incas, Morley about the Maya, and Valent about the Aztecs. These will well repay the time that you might care to give to them and tell you a great deal about these fascinating Americans whom the Europeans found. Now, just to recapitulate, who were they? They were Asiatics. Whence did they come? Okay, from Asia. How did they come? Most probably by Bering Strait. When did they come? At least 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, maybe much, much earlier than that. Why? You answer that. Why would you come? And what did they bring? Well, we've seen a few of those. Now, next week, our story is that of the surprise that was in store for the Spaniards when they began to poke around. So be with us when we're not going to sing it, but when the theme is fairy tales can come true, it can happen to you. It happened to the Spaniards. So that's all until next week.